This is the Energy Makers Show, featuring the innovators, financiers, and policymakers focused on the global energy demand. Brought to you by NRG, moving clean energy forward. And here's your host, Paul Dickerson.
Hi, I'm Paul Dickerson, and welcome to another episode of the Energy Makers Show. This week, we cover a variety of energy topics with a special focus on water. First up, Laura Capper, founder of Cap Resources, a consulting company with years of energy industry experience. Following that, I speak with John Dennis, founder and managing director of WoodRock, an investment bank with offices both here in Houston and in London. All that right after this.
Where will the energy come from to move us forward? From natural sources in abundant supply, or perhaps a man-made source? At NRG, we believe innovation will solve our energy needs. That's why NRG is moving away from fossil fuels towards wind, solar, and other sustainable technologies to power the smart grid, the electric car, and our clean energy future. We're using all of our energy to develop more of it.
This is the Energy Makers Show, brought to you by NRG, moving clean energy forward. And now, back to the Energy Makers Show with your host, Paul Dickerson.
Welcome to another episode of the Energy Makers Show. Today, we're visiting with Laura Capper, founder and CEO of Cap Resources. Laura, great to have you on the program.
Great to see you. Thank you.
So tell us about Cap Resources.
Sure. We are a boutique consulting firm. We've been around about 15 years, and most of our work revolves around the energy sector, so both conventional and alternative energies. We work with a lot of new energy technology developers and help them identify the market, make sure that they've got a strategy to go to market, and then try to help them get customers to take up those new technologies sooner rather than later. So it's really fun work. We get to see kind of cutting edge stuff and
Sure.
Completely enjoy it.
Well, I couldn't resist. Here I am flipping through World Oil the other day for a client, and I see there's Cap Resources, and it was on a water issue, no less. So if you don't mind, I'd love to visit a little bit about water. But first, tell me about the write-up and about your practice.
Sure. A neat client of ours with some very sharp engineers put together that article and cited our market study as part of that. So as you know, anytime you're looking at a big market, it's not only how big is it, but what's really going on today. You know, there's always potential. So everybody in this industry is kind of trying to get their arms around what's the right thing to do with water, and it's actually a pretty complex problem. And that was actually a fairly technical article that was just a great overview that some engineers put together, kind of addressing different ways to treat water today.
Well, I've had so many of our guests talk about fracking, right? All of the benefits, you know, what it means for our nation. But you're the first water expert to come on and just sort of talk about that. And I thought maybe we'd start with fracking.
Sure.
And maybe you can just, for the viewers, lay out what are the issues related to water and fracking.
So fracking is an abbreviation for fracturing a well. So if you think of a fracture, it's a little crack. So essentially they're pulling up trucks with huge volumes of water and using that water as a means to pressure pump and create cracks or fissures in the rock.
Right.
And then they prop it open with sand. And those little fissures allow the gas to escape. So it's become a science unto itself, is how do you best make those little cracks within the rock, and obviously you're using water to do that. So you've got all this water that was already in the reservoir, then you're putting down more water to create these fissures, and sooner or later that water is going to flow back to the surface.
Right.
So part of the whole deal around fracturing is what do we do, where's our source water coming from, and what are we going to do with that water so we can hopefully reuse it when it trickles back up to the surface. And today, over 50% of the wells in the U.S. are fractured. So it went from being just a handful in the 80s. Actually, George Mitchell, a Houstonian, was the first to really commercialize slickwater fracs. To now, it's really the dominant way to complete a well. So it's going on everywhere.
And are there best practices, say, in the gas wells versus the oil fracked wells? things that you've seen that work better than others?
Well, certainly, and I'm far from being the expert on what those exact best practices are related to fracturing, but there are some very evident trends in the way that they're using water these days.
Right.
So obviously you want the right mix of water and other constituents to get the job done right,
Sure.
but you also want something easy to clean up at the end so you can reuse it. So there's several things going on in industry now. A number of the very large service providers are coming up with what they call open frac programs, where they're actually disclosing exactly what they're putting in the water.
Okay.
Most of the large service providers, and certainly all the big oil and gas guys, are investing, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in trying to figure out how to recycle that water so they can reuse it. And one of the things that's gotten everybody even more excited lately is that these gas shales that we were tackling all over the U.S., we're now finding a lot of oil shales associated with that. And as you know, oil pricing is going a little bit better these days than gas pricing. So we're kind of seeing a migration. A lot of folks that were only doing gas shales are looking for those oil plays that are in the Permian Basin and the Eagle Ford and some of those areas that are pretty dynamic these days.
So what else do we need to be thinking about when it comes to water and energy?
Well, the funny part of water, and nobody calls it what it is, it's not just the water use that's an issue. I mean, we're all becoming highly aware on a global basis that, water is probably the most valuable commodity we have. So there's just this general thing going on recognizing the value of water. In fact, I heard a survey the other day that said consumers were more concerned with water and environmental issues today than they were, in fact, of global warming. So that's kind of shifted in their minds. But along with the water is not just the water itself, but how do you get it in and out? Are you going to build pipelines that can take many, many years and are very expensive? The real big issue is trucks. If you're trucking this stuff in and out and you don't have nearby resources, you're potentially impacting roads. If you look at areas like Pennsylvania that are very hilly, you just don't want hundreds of trucks in your backyard. So one way to eliminate that traffic is to try to get the water locally, but then recycle it and reuse it locally. And that's really kind of the holy grail of what we'd all like to do as far as water related to fracking.
And the government agencies looking at this, is it all under EPA, or are other agencies getting involved?
That is a story into itself, so I will keep it at just the highest levels because I would certainly say something wrong there. Honestly, there have been some practices in the past where a lot of the oil and gas industry was excluded from the Safe Water Drinking Act. Right. And that's been recognized over the last 5 or 10 years. And there's been a huge amount of scrutiny both at state environmental agencies as well as at the federal level. And really what has to happen is, operators have to work hand in hand with these environmental agencies, which they are, and kind of determine best practices. And there's a huge amount of misperceptions about fracturing as well, and that's stirred up a lot of conversation.
Now, Laura, we hear periodically about how some of the fracking fluid, there's been more and more concern about that fluid getting up into the drinking water. What's your take?
Sure, and there's been a huge amount of community concern voiced about that, and a whole lot of speculation. I think it's really only been recently that they're kind of pinning down whether that's an issue or not. There have certainly been some water supplies that have been contaminated by gas sources, but the question is, why or how did that happen? Sure. And what they found is that there wasn't a direct correlation with fracturing, as we were all concerned about. Most of it really came from human error, so it could have been a pipeline break, or somebody wasn't doing their job right, cleaning up a particular well site. Maybe it ran into the water supply. So obviously that should never happen, and that's wrongness in itself. but there has been no findings, and the government's done an incredible job of checking into this, that shows fracturing itself, the process, is impacting drinking water supplies in any way. So I think that was a great relief to us all.
Well, sure, absolutely. And it sounds like something the public needs to be made more aware of to alleviate some of those concerns.
They do. As much as I love the new technology side and oil and gas side, I don't know that we are always the best spokesman for our industry. I think there could be a lot more communication that could put some of these fears to rest. But I think the industry is getting better about explaining these things now than they used to be.
Now, Laura, in speaking with earlier guests, I've heard that many companies are looking to take U.S. technology and fracking overseas and use that to fracture both oil and gas and other countries on the water issues. Are you seeing these same issues being brought up in other countries?
I think in the long run, they're going to be more pronounced internationally in the long run. Today, all those international efforts are in their infancy. They're not drilling tens of thousands of wells. They're drilling 5 to 10 to 100 wells in a given area. Right. So it really hasn't mounted to be kind of that commercial production kind of issue associated with shales. However, the water shortages and water issues in other countries are amazing.
Well, Laura, it was about time that we had some expert here to talk about water. Thank you so much for coming on. I hope you'll come back.
I would love to. Been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that concludes my discussion with Laura Capper. We'll be right back with more right after this.
The future is here.
You can't see it. It's electric.
At NRG, we're providing clean energy and now charging stations to make the electric car a reality. Kinda makes you want a boogie woogie, doesn't it? NRG, moving clean energy forward.
It's electric.
This is the Energy Makers Show, brought to you by NRG, moving clean energy forward. And now back to the Energy Makers Show with your host, Paul Dickerson.
Welcome to the Energy Makers Show. Today we have with us Mr. John Dennis, founder of WoodRock. John, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, John, you founded WoodRock in 1998. What sets WoodRock apart from other investment banks?
I would say the primary difference is that all of the managing directors in our firm, while they all started in a transaction side of the business, big street firms, commercial banks, et cetera, they all left somewhere in their late 20s, early 30s, and they spent some time in operating companies.
Well, and what led you to target the energy space for investment and helping companies invest?
So we started the firm thinking we would do things other than energy, but as the firm grew and as people came to the firm and their talents had all been in energy to some degree, it was just kind of a logical way to expand the firm and to expand the energy practice. And also, we were able to find a part of the energy corporate finance marketplace that wasn't being served by the big street firms or firms like Simmons & Company.
Well, and the firm has been expanding. Did I hear that you've really expanded your operations overseas and are now in London?
Absolutely. We had good fortune and good luck during these hard times to be able to attract some great folks as they were coming out of other firms. So we have, in 2009, we opened a London office with 2 former Nomura guys. They live in London. They've done a great job for us. We've been able to expand our domestic team, and in part and parcel of all of that has been really a further penetration in the energy market. And when I say that, I merely mean the kind of full spectrum of the energy market, from E&P to renewables. And we've also expanded kind of internationally, because the new guys that have come into the firm have had South American experience, Asian experience. We just this week are closing a deal in Africa.
Well, I do want to hit much more on that international experience in a minute. As far as opportunities in the United States, domestically, what opportunities for investment are you seeing?
Because of the natural gas and the shale drilling opportunities, there's a whole world of businesses and opportunities that kind of have opened up as a result of that. One of them, which I think is particularly interesting, is anything that has to do with shale drilling and fracking is really the necessity for water. So parallel with everything that's going on in the gas drilling side of the world and in conventional oil drilling in the United States, you now have a need for water, and water in some cases being the constraining factor. So there are a number of private equity firms that are really taking water as a play, everything from permits and licensing rights and water rights in general to the equipment to move it, shape it, clean it, pump it, store it, etc. And we have been focused on that for about 2 years, but we kind of came at it from a different angle. And we are seeing a great deal of activity there, and I think that that'll continue for the foreseeable future, as I think water ultimately becomes our great constraining factor.
We saw some of the newspapers have come out pretty hard on shale gas, and is it a reality? Is it not? What's your take on the shale play?
I think it is a huge opportunity for the United States. I think that it is at the moment stretching the brains of both governments and businesses as to what to do with it. Right. I like the fact it's perplexing to folks. I think that's just making them think outside the box. If you believe Aubrey McClendon, we've got more natural gas here than Saudi Arabia has oil in a BOE kind of comparison. That's a great problem to have. And but I would tell you that probably one of the great issues with it is how do you get that much hydraulic fracking fluid into the ground? Sure. And how do you get it into the ground without contaminating the water table? And at what point is using water to generate natural gas economic, or using a scarce resource to create another resource? So you go back to, I would argue, some water issues, but I think I think gas needs to be a part of a very, very significant kind of national energy plan and thought process, and we have got to use it. Yeah. We just can't continue to import what we have from countries that don't have our interests at heart.
Well, to help us better understand where WoodRock is playing internationally, can you pick one of these international deals or companies or transactions and tell us a little more?
Going really to that kind of longer time frame, we are right now working on a series of photovoltaic projects that are in Italy. And the banks are willing to come in for a certain amount of that capital, but the underlying majority of the capital, it's about a 50-50 debt equity structure, is coming from a European family that's been investing for something along the lines of 300 years. And they think in terms of generations. And so they are pricing their equity somewhere between probably senior debt and kind of sub-debt, but it's an equity-like structure with an equity-like return, but an equity-like return that's not captured in 5 to 7 years, but it's captured kind of over a 20-year lifetime.
Can you share with the audience some of the perceptions that you've heard about how America's energy policy affects how the world views America as a place for investment?
The overwhelming perception that we hear when we talk to our foreign colleagues is that America does not have a long-term energy policy. Rather, the government is making very myopic, short-term, incentive-based or tax-based kind of incentive programs. Those programs have very short lifespans, meaning a year, 2 years, 3 years. There's some question about whether they're going to be grandfathered if the law should change going forward. And the result is you just don't have a long enough horizon on the regulatory policy for people to make decisions of any substantial length. The Europeans, on the other hand, have effectively centralized their energy policies, and that has led to long-term directional decisions being made. Yes, those have sometimes changed, but they're fundamentally long-term directional decisions, policies to support those long-term directional decisions, and a buy-in on the part of the citizenry, the infrastructure, corporations, et cetera, to implement on that strategy. Germany is a great example, and their photovoltaic efforts. So the criticism is often, why can't the U.S. get its longer-term image together? Why are they always thinking very short-term?
Heard the same thing.
Yep.
Absolutely. Yep. We hear a lot from the executive branch about the EPA ratcheting up some of its regulation. Right. We were talking about the natural gas industry. Sure. What is your perception about what we either need to do more of or less when it comes to regulation?
I think it's very simple, and I think there's a growing chorus in the community that we work in, which is decisions and regulations need to be made and they need to be held to for some substantial period of time. There is this sense that the politicians and regulatory decisions are kind of blowing with the wind, and so decisions made 1 month or 6 months later are getting changed. That long-term regulatory policy, if it could just be of some substantial amount of term, right. And I'm not saying 30 years, just 5 years would be great. You could see you could see folks actually doing the math and making investments around those economics, whatever they are. At the moment, there's real uncertainty.
Well, let's switch gears and talk renewables. I know you've had a unique vantage point as an investor and investment banker when it comes to the renewable space. What are you seeing occurring, and what's the next 18 months look like?
For much of the last 5, 6, 7 years, there has been a tendency to pile on to a given technology, to a given renewable. It could be ethanol as a way to oxygenate gasoline. It could be wind as the end-all solution. It could be biodiesel. It could be photovoltaic. I mean, it's been at certain times all of those. Where what has happened is that there's been a rush of capital into those businesses. There have been a rush of projects, and in some cases, the really worst things happen is some of the incentives, tax-driven incentives, have expired, and suddenly those industries have become uneconomic in their entirety, become uneconomic. So what we have seen and we've kind of seen it in Europe first, and we're starting to see it back here in the United States, is that there's a more holistic approach that wind's not going to solve every situation. Photovoltaic's not going to solve every situation, but a combination of photovoltaic, wind, and scrubbed coal might be a way to actually have a less polluting, more renewable source of power, but it works through all seasons, through all climates, through over a 30-year period of time.
So you're starting to see companies begin to combine all different power sources into a single business?
Right, exactly. Or a given project. I wouldn't say necessarily a business, but a given project to meet the power needs, or in the case of electrical power, to meet the power needs of a given region. It's really kind of a holistic approach as opposed to just building more coal-fired plants. Or we'll build a wind farm and that'll solve everything. Right. And I think increasingly the projects that we're looking at in the United States, be they photovoltaic or be they wind, they now often have a photovoltaic, they'll be photovoltaic, but they'll have some sort of electric power generating capability for when the sun's not shining or for nighttime use. Or it'll be a wind facility that'll have some sort of a power generating capacity.
Well, John, you're a great leader and a great friend. Thank you so much for coming on the program today. And that wraps this discussion with John Dennis, founder of WoodRock.